I think I would say that my work has evolved quite a bit, and a lot of that is the recognition of
Mhm.
well-being practices, to be
Uh-huh. Oh,
honest,
okay. Yeah.
and yeah, so I was, as I mentioned many times, like a frontline responder for
Yes.
most of my journey. So when there were crises in community, to think about, well, what is a campaign? What is a response? What is the
Uh-huh.
policy, right? How do we bring people together to talk about it? And I spent most of my time doing that. And I think I recognized uh, around probably like at the 8 to 10 year mark, the 8 year mark of doing that I was kind of numb. I
Mm.
wasn't like responding with the same level of energy or the same level of, I think, rigor
Mm-hmm.
or ideas that I had before. And it was because I was feeling exhausted and
Yeah.
fatigued.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Mamta Akapati. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. This episode is sponsored by Leadershape. Go to leadershape.org to learn how they can work with you to create a just, caring, and thriving world. Today's episode is also sponsored by Simplicity. A true partner, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life with technology platforms that empower institutions to make data-driven decisions. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast for more information about each sponsor. As I mentioned, my name is Mamta Akapati. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am broadcasting today from Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is situated on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Humanos, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Lipan Apache, and Tonkawa peoples. I'm really excited for this conversation today. I am joined today by globally recognized activist and scholar Deepa Iyer. Deepa is a weaver, a frontline responder, a storyteller, and a guide. Through her work at the Building Movement Project, Deepa creates narratives, provides trainings, and facilitates networks around social change and solidarity practice. Her political and community homes include Asian American, South Asian, Muslim, and Arab spaces, where she spent 15 years responding to the backlash of the September 11 attacks. Deepa served as executive director of South Asian Americans Leading Together, also known as SALT, for a decade, and has also held positions at Race Forward, the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, and the Asian American Justice Center. Her first book, We Too Sing America, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh immigrants shape our multiracial future, received a 2016 American Book Award. In 2019, Deepa received an honorary doctoral degree from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. An immigrant who moved to Kentucky from Kerala, India, when she was 12, Deepa graduated from the University of Notre Dame Law School and Vanderbilt University. As we engage in this conversation and learn from Deepa's life journey and wisdom, I am especially excited to celebrate the launch of her second book, which I have right here with me, Social Change Now, a guide for reflection and connection. So we'll definitely get to great conversations. So I'm really excited about our conversation ahead. But let's go ahead and get started. So Deepa, I'm so excited. Like this is like a dream come true to be with you in community. I'm so glad to join you in community on our podcast today in Student Affairs Now. So welcome to the podcast. But before we begin, can you tell me a little bit about you and your current role?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm so glad to be here, Mamta. I was so happy when you reached out. I feel like, especially both of us being South Asian women, it's so important to support and encourage one another. And you've always done that. So I appreciate you. And it's great to, be talking to folks and talking to you about issues that are affecting young people and educators around the country. So my point of entry, I guess, into this conversation is that I am someone who's pretty steeped in the nonprofit sector and in social movement spaces. And so I come into this conversation with the experiences of someone who's worked in both local and national nonprofits, and also in coalitions and networks, oftentimes during times of crisis. So you mentioned the post September 11th backlash, and so a lot of my work and what I have learned really stems from understanding and assisting community members who faced hate violence, racial and religious profiling, and surveillance over those, the decade and a half after 9/11. And some of those experiences are documented in a book that I wrote, which really was rooted in this sense that our young people had such a sanitized understanding of what happened in the wake of 9/11, and often an incomplete understanding. And so a lot of that book is related to kind of expanding the narrative that we usually tell. And so I come into this space, as someone who's done frontline response work, storytelling work, and also really clear about a lot of the privileges that I hold as someone who has caste privilege, who has education privilege, and recognizing that it's important to understand how those privileges can play a role in sort of the way that we lead or the way that we connect with others as well. So I'll leave it there, but looking forward to kind of taking a deeper dive.
Well, I love you taking us through the arc, particularly in over the last 15, 20 years, about how that journey unfolded for you. Tell me about what sparked, even before that, like what gave you clarity that this was the journey that you were going to go on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think some of it is rooted, and I think this is the case for so many immigrants, rooted in the experiences that my family had when we moved to Kentucky from Kerala, India, and it was in the mid-'80s. And at that time, in Kentucky particularly, race was sort of really just looked at as a black or white paradigm, was a binary. And so for me, I had really no sense of my racial identity. I had no sense of understanding, where I fit. But what was really clear to me is that I was an outsider and I didn't belong. And, I think we experience that in so many ways, like whether it was related to language access or accent discrimination or, bullying and school. And so I think I've always kind of carried this sense of displacement and understanding what it means to be on the outside, and then recognizing that I wanted to do something to open up spaces where people, regardless of their background, were able to feel like they belonged. And so I think for me, I've been on this quest of belonging for quite some time, and I have not felt a clearer sense of belonging than I do when I'm in spaces where people are really focused on creating change in their communities. That's where I feel connected. And so it wasn't like a direct path, but it was a path that I was pretty clear about in my by my mid-20s. And so I've not looked back since then, and feel like this is really like my purpose and sort of the way in which I want to be in the world.
I think it's really inspiring because I hear an acknowledgement of past experiences, right, that obviously maybe inform whether it's reacting to or healing of, journeys that we may have been on, but that it's an unfolding journey. I like that you said it wasn't direct. I think sometimes we think that we have to have absolute clarity in how we're going to do social change. We have to have absolute clarity. We have to know everything all the time, right? This kind of notion of, if I don't do it perfectly, then I'm going to mess it up. And so I think, honestly, that's why I was so excited about your social change ecosystem framework, because, also, so as someone having done this work, as a career, there was something about your framework, a lot about your framework, that gave me space to breathe and say, this is a way that all of us can find it
Mhm.
in our heart and a methodology, even in our uncomfortable spaces, to find a way to enter social change.
Right.
So I'll stop talking, but I would love to hear what inspired the concept of the social change ecosystem framework.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you reflecting that back. And I'll go back to kind
Mm-hmm.
of what you said as I talk about the framework. So this framework is, honestly the result of feeling like I didn't know where I belonged. And it comes from that space. So the way that it even emerged for me was that I had left SALT, where I had been an executive director for 10 years and been really steeped in like the South Asian community spaces, and really felt I didn't know where I fit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also the time period when, the last administration um, was really putting out a lot of policies that were
Mm-hmm.
harming immigrant communities, communities of color, and Muslims and the like. And
Mm-hmm.
so I felt this real sense of outrage almost every single day. And I also felt a real sense of overwhelm because I didn't know sort of how to plug in.
Yeah.
And I basically looked back at like where, you know, at different spaces I've been part of. And I realized that folks and organizations usually tend to show up in different roles, that when they're connected and when they're part of sort of a bigger strategy can really create change. And so that was really the impetus for it. This framework is not, I think the way that people are relating to it is really based on their personal experience, obviously, or their
Mm-hmm.
organizational vantage point. But it's also something that is in conversation with so many different styles of leadership and books and frameworks that have been written. That it builds on all of that. So I also, really recognize that it's in a much bigger context. But one of the things that I think can be helpful about this framework, and it goes back to what you said, is that I think it allows us, you said something like you said, it allowed me to breathe. And I think that what the framework can often do is help us recognize that we don't have to carry
Mm-hmm.
or play all of these roles. And
Yeah.
also that we don't have to be so closely wedded to like one or two just because we've done it a lot, right? And so even in my
Mm-hmm.
experience, I had always shown up as a frontline responder, but I
Yeah.
recognized that it was taking a toll on me physically and
Mm-hmm.
emotionally.
Yes.
Yet I didn't want to leave social change work
Yes.
or movement
Mm-hmm.
spaces or community because that's where I belong. And so thinking about how I could perhaps be a guide and mentor other frontline responders, right, is a way for me to still stay connected and to still feel like I have something valuable to offer and not have to completely leave, the community and the ecosystems that I care about. So I think it offers an opportunity to kind of flex different skill sets, learn different skills, and be in connection with others as well.
That's beautiful. And I know you're referencing component parts of your framework, as you kind of reference guide or a storyteller, or frontline responder. Can you share a little bit more about the components of the framework and how you think it can be useful for us as educators?
Yeah. So to learn more, I would say you could check out socialchangemap.com, where you could kind of see the framework visually and learn more about it. But basically, it has three elements to it. It offers an opportunity for us to think about what our shared values are. And so
Mm-hmm.
for educators, social justice educators in particular, even, it's an opportunity to think about, what is it that we're trying to convey, what is important to us. Maybe it's like complete histories or more access points, inclusion, right? Whatever the shared values are. The second component of the framework is to think about the roles that we can show
Mm-hmm.
up as in terms of either educators, or if you're working with young people, right, what they could
Mm-hmm.
show up as. And there are 10 roles that we're invited to consider. They range from storyteller to visionary to builder to experimenter to healer to caregiver, and so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. And each of those roles has different characteristics. and also room to improve, right?
Mhm.
And then the third aspect of this framework is that it's premised on this idea that we are all connected, that we do
Mhm.
better when we work in solidarity rather than silos. Really, I think lifts up and amplifies what we often hear from Indigenous communities, that we're
Right.
kindred, that we're relatives, right? And so recognizing that even in social change work,
Mhm.
that it's important to have those deeper connections, whether it's between people or between organizations as well. Not to say that there isn't conflict and that there isn't disagreement, but it's an opportunity to lean into that if it's generative. So how can educators use it? I think in a couple of different ways. One, it can be used as a teaching tool
Mhm.
with young people who care about social change and are looking for entry points to help them think through what are the roles that they're naturally aligning with and who is part of their broader ecosystem. A second way is to use it as a mapping tool for, the department that you work in, perhaps. So, if there are, say, DEI task forces on campus, or if there's an initiative around inclusion, or if there are multicultural centers in conversation with each other, it's an opportunity to think about what is our role vis-a-vis the broader university or the broader institutional ecosystem? Are we
Right.
disruptors? And many are,
Yes.
right? And how
Right.
do we disrupt in a way that can push the institution to take some bolder steps, for example? So those are just a couple of ways in which it could be utilized.
I want to you just sparked a whole series of probably what could be another podcast conversation for me and what you just said. So I hadn't played with the idea of organizations with their unique roles, either separate organizations or organizational entities, if we're talking higher education within a university context. But so I pulled up, the social change ecosystem map, just for my own context, and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, if sometimes I think offices think that they have to be all things to all people. So if you're trying to engage in social change and you're the student conduct office, or you're the fraternity and sorority life office, and I know that may seem controversial to say, people want to write off certain organizations, but everybody has an opportunity to enter in a different way. I think sometimes, particularly me and my dominant identities, I appreciate you naming yours. In my dominant identities, I feel like I have to enter full force in the same ways that members of those communities enter as well, when maybe I need to step back, reflect, and see with humility maybe where my point of entry might be different. But I think representatives of offices, like
Mhm.
an office could say, wow, we're student activities, we might enter in the space of storytelling because maybe our storytelling of different communities is incomplete, rather
Right,
than maybe them being a frontline responder, maybe a
right.
frontline responder, maybe a counseling center or multicultural affairs office is better equipped and trained to
Mhm.
be a more effective for frontline responder. And so together, if we all recognize our roles, then we are you said something that was powerful.
Mhm.
We could be part of a bigger strategy for social change. So
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on that? Like,
No, you totally got it, Mamta. Of course, you described it so well. The framework is multidimensional.
uh-huh.
Individuals can use it, but so can organizations, and so can bigger networks and coalitions and task forces and even movements. And so, exactly what you said. I have worked with institutions of higher education
Uh-huh.
who will say, we've got this kind of DEI pledge and commitment, but we
Yes.
have a lot of different entities in our institution that are part of this task force, right? And they all kind of have different things that they do. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in that context, this framework could be used to, one, really get clear on what the shared values are when we say
Mm-hmm.
DEI, because those are just words that are
Yes.
buzzwords, So, like,
Yes.
how do we define what does it mean to get there, right? What's
Mm-hmm.
our boldest vision of what DEI looks like on our campus and practice?
Uh-huh.
How will the campus change when we get there? So that is like a values conversation. A second thing that that could happen is that all of those entities that are part of this bigger, push for DEI could, like you said, map themselves on the framework. And so it's possible to understand that there might be some people who play the role of a visionary to say, this is our North Star, this is where we want to be in 5 years. But to get there, we often need builders and experimenters who can actually implement that vision. So who will play those roles, right? And how are they going to be in contact with the visionaries, and have that feedback loop? Who are the healers in the space?
Yeah.
Because a lot of institutions of higher learning, have been built on a capitalist or extractive model, are often, basically taking over neighborhoods and gentrifying cities, right? And so we have to recognize that there has to be a healing process. You can't talk about like getting to DEI if you haven't recognized like past harm. And so who are the healers that we're able to kind of bring into this conversation who can make those things more clear and transparent, and then lead us through like a process of acknowledgement and accountability, or whatever the case is. So that's how a task force on DEI on a campus could make sure that it's like identifying its roles and its shared values, and then implementing action steps.
I really, I value that. I've often thought about, I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. And so it's always toggled between student affairs and chief diversity officer. And in this, or chief diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, the range of DEI offices. I hadn't thought about this either, but your idea of kind of using and leveraging this model as a tool to calibrate values before you go into a planning or a task force operations, because oftentimes when we do that, we're often reacting to, right? There's a task force that's convened because some reactive incident happened on campus. It usually isn't what creation are we in, it's what are we reacting to? And now then we, sometimes say, okay, now we need to create. But if we were truly centering it around, what is the world we want to create for the future, this model really allows us to center and not, I should say, calibrate a set of values, aspirational values, and get clear about the methodologies we want to engage as we're going on that journey. So it organizes us in a thoughtful way, which I appreciate.
Yeah. And I think it's not surprising. We do this in the nonprofit sector and movement spaces all the time, right? We assume that we all have the same understanding of what certain concepts mean. We assume that we all have the same political analysis. And it's not the case. And that's not something to feel badly about. It's just we're all on a different trajectory of learning and unlearning. And so and we don't often take the time to pause. And I definitely, this is a challenge for me too, because I tend to be the frontline responder, who's like, there's a crisis, we need to act, let's worry about everything else later, right? But I think this allows us an opportunity at least to have an initial conversation to say, why are we coming together? What is it that, we believe in and want to achieve? And even if we don't agree on everything, whether it's values or political analysis, what is it that we have enough shared agreement around that we can utilize to iterate and experiment? And then let's also just commit to coming back, right? So like, 3 months later, when the crisis perhaps is abated, we will come back and really deepen this conversation that we started.
Well, you mentioned something earlier, so connecting that to your current thought around, how do we kind of shift our lenses based on some of the different identities we might share, right? So if I'm a frontline responder and I need to take a step back, in what ways do the healers activate in a different way, or the storytellers or guides, like that we can tag in and tag out in some ways, and which then allows us collectively to stay in it, right? I'm looking back and I have to ask you the question, when I began doing this work early on in my career, I felt like I need to take responsibility for the fact that I really led with like this litmus test model. Like if you don't, do X, Y, and Z things, then you're not XYZ effective enough, and therefore just leave, and I'm not very proud of that, but I need to take ownership of that in my very early kind of journey. And I think what you offer for me is a way to heal through that.
Mm.
And to say, okay, like we need to step in. When we need to do our own, whatever, it may not be healing, but well-being efforts, that, we have the opportunity to step in and step out. I don't think that I ever have felt that way, in my prior work.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like your model gives me permission to say, stepping away doesn't mean you're stepping out. It means you can engage differently.
Yeah. So
Burnout is
well
big.
said, by the
Yeah.
way.
Oh, thank you.
I loved how you
Mm.
framed it. Stepping away is not stepping out. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think that, obviously, for those of us who've been doing work in social movements and communities for quite some time, we know that context is everything, right? And
Yeah.
things
Yeah, that's true.
change all the time, and things change in our lives, things change in our communities, things change
Mhm.
politically. And so holding on to one role for like 20, 30 years, I think is not only
Yes.
stagnant, for the
Yeah.
person, but it doesn't really generate new ideas into our communities or our institutions or our sectors. And so it's really important, I think, to recognize whether it's burnout or whether it's sort of like, okay, we've been doing the same thing over and over again, and it's not really working, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
ineffectiveness or whether it's redundancies. I think it's important to actually take stock of some of that.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the next step is, well, I have to like leave, and like it's not, or we have to just completely change everything and overhaul everything. No, I think there are
Mhm.
incremental ways to kind of address those realities by switching roles or stepping away or
Mhm.
thinking of a different strategy for the organization or the institution to play, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, I think we're kind of, we get really stuck and stagnant. And I don't think that that's helpful, especially when we're trying to address really big issues and, create pathways for people
Mhm.
and build power.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my profession, positionally, I think many of us do sit in spaces, and it continues to increase, right? As we think about how our life continues to get more and more complex. We're seeing a lot of burnout in my
Mm.
profession across the board. What reflections might you offer to those of us who are working through burnout or trying not to burn out? Like, what coaching would you
Mhm.
offer us as you think about this?
Yeah, I think that this is such a live question. I'm not an expert on it, at all.
Yeah.
I would also recommend folks listening to or reading books by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky on trauma stewardship. She's got
Mhm.
the Trauma Stewardship Institute, and she's got a
Mhm.
podcast as well, because I think she offers and her guests offer really uh, lots of good tips on this topic. But I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I think that I think it's really important. And the book that I just wrote
Mhm.
has like a section at the end on sustainability
Yeah.
and well-being. I think that it's really important to recognize, one, when our cup is emptying. And a lot of that sort of personal
Mhm.
self-awareness is so important. And then also recognizing what are the factors that tend to deplete our cup or our
Yes.
energy. Is it because of institutional values being misaligned with what we believe? Because that can lead to
Mhm.
burnout, emotional burnout.
Absolutely.
Is it
Mhm.
because we are playing too many roles on that framework and we need to actually take some action ourselves? Is it because we don't have a strong enough ecosystem to support us? And what can we do to
Mhm.
build that? So I think that kind of, understanding of what are the cues? And I think we all know them, or we know them
Mhm.
for
Yeah, yeah,
ourselves, right?
absolutely.
We're
Yeah.
feeling like that tug. So like getting more clear about that, more rigorous about recognizing those cues. And then secondly, I think taking some action steps related to them so that we're not like, okay, like there's nothing and I'm just going to have to,
Mhm.
right? So, and I think some of it is on us.
Oh,
Some of it
absolutely.
is
Yeah.
on but I think also some of it's on our ecosystems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what are sort of like institutional policies around taking care of staff well-being? What
Mm-hmm.
are, what are sort of the nonprofit, I know the nonprofit sector better.
Mm-hmm.
And I've
Mm-hmm.
definitely seen over the last few years, particularly with the pandemic, that there's more of a focus on healing and well-being. So whether it's trauma-informed supervision, or whether
Mm-hmm.
it's sabbaticals or coaches being offered, right? Or mental health stipends for folks in the nonprofit sector.
Mm-hmm.
These are all institutional policies that can be put into place. And then I think each of us bears an onus in recognizing how it is that we're going to build out some strategies to care for our well-being as well.
Mm-hmm. So as you kind of reflect on the arc of your journey, your book came out this year, just last month. How, so even though it came out last month, obviously it's been an arc of a long time coming, to the creation and delivery of this book. How do you engage in social change work differently today than you did when you first started?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I think I would say that my work has evolved quite a bit, and a lot of that is the recognition of
Mhm.
well-being practices, to be
Uh-huh. Oh,
honest,
okay. Yeah.
and yeah, so I was, as I mentioned many times, like a frontline responder for
Yes.
most of my journey. So when there were crises in community, to think about, well, what is a campaign? What is a response? What is the
Uh-huh.
policy, right? How do we bring people together to talk about it? And I spent most of my time doing that. And I think I recognized uh, around probably like at the 8 to 10 year mark, the 8 year mark of doing that I was kind of numb. I
Mm.
wasn't like responding with the same level of energy or the same level of, I think, rigor
Mm-hmm.
or ideas that I had before. And it was because I was feeling exhausted and
Yeah.
fatigued. And
Yeah.
so that is one of the reasons that, I realized it was time for me to kind of move away from the organizational work I was doing,
Yeah.
and create room for new leadership and new ideas, but also that I needed to kind of shift my own role so I could stay in the space without feeling like I was just putting in like 10% or calling it in,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
shifting my role to storyteller, which
Mm-hmm.
is why I wrote the book, shifting my role to the first book I wrote, was
Mm-hmm.
was really around that idea of being a storyteller, or to be a guide to other frontline responders, or to even being an experimenter, which is what I feel like I've been doing more recently with looking at different resources that
Right.
might be helpful for people and different tools, has really energized me
Yes.
and kept me connected to the work that I care about, but also feel like I really can bring everything that I have to it.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really heartwarming. I think again, I just keep reiterating. I think sometimes those of us that enter social change work think that we have to operate at a certain force all the time, right? And just the continual reminder of, our enoughness in the moment is enough, right?
Right.
And so what does that mean to kind of hold sacred, like that we are the tool by which we're doing the work? And if you think of holding something sacred, you treat it differently than, oh, it's a check the box thing. So if I'm
Right.
if I'm holding myself sacred, then I'm going to treat myself differently
Mm-hmm.
to stay in this for the long haul. I want to go back to something. You've used this phrase a couple of times, this like a point of entry into the work. And there are pieces, and we don't know each other very well. I'm a big fan, and so but there are some resonances in our story when you talked about growing up, kind of in a black white paradigm. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and it is not that now. But when I was growing
Right.
up, we grew up in an all black neighborhood, and it was very much a black and white paradigm. And so I think my messaging and just how I understood
Mm-hmm.
myself in the context of a black white paradigm, hearing you talk about your experience helps me contextualize my own around where do I enter the race conversation, right? So as I grappled in my profession, where do I enter? Or there isn't a place for me to enter because I might be taking up too much space in a particularly in our geography rooted very much right in anti-Blackness, right? And so how do I enter that conversation without feeling like I'm taking up space with my story? Now I recognize, of course, it's an interconnected story. So I guess my question's twofold. For those of us that may be socialized to think that we don't have a space in the story, the other space where I find parallel is around my dominant identity. So the spaces where I hold privilege and power. How can I really embrace this framework to tap into the courage I need to do this work from my privileged identities? I think it's, I'm not going to say it's easier, but I see a through line in the identities that I share that may have experienced depression, right, systemically. But as a dominant identity person, so as somebody with caste privilege, as somebody with citizenship, as somebody with education, and so able-bodied, heterosexism, and many of those other, I have more privileged identities than not. How can I really courageously use this framework?
I love that question, Mamta, and it's something I grapple with myself all the time. I think a couple of things are coming up for me. I think when we talk about points of entry, it can sort of be couched in a couple of different ways, and you already mentioned them. I think one is identity. Two is privilege and positionality. And third is experience. I often think about those three different buckets when I think about points of entry, of my own points of entry. And often it feels in some spaces, right, that identity trumps everything and or privilege trumps everything. And I think we have to be careful about that, because when we do that, we sort of say, well, if you hold these sorts of identities, you're in. If you hold those sorts of privileges, you're out. And I think that is, I don't think that that's a productive or effective way of doing social change or doing equity work and inclusion work, right? Because it goes against the values of inclusion if you prioritize certain identities or certain privileges or whatever the case. But I think that's important. And I think we also have to really balance that with recognizing that, and we talk about this in our solidarity work all the time, that we have to really follow the lead of people who are most directly affected by a particular issue or by a context, because they have experiences we don't, and they also have solutions that we don't, right? If we're not part of that directly affected community in that context. So I think it's a balance of the points of entry and our orientation towards, making sure that we're listening and lifting up people who are most directly affected, and doing all of that with a level of humility. And also a level of recognizing that sometimes we are going to make mistakes, and that there is some grace and possibility in redemption and in learning and unlearning. I think all of that has to be part of these containers that we create, right? But I do feel like this framework, I love what you said, like a courageous way to use the framework. It is a way to say, I'm going to I come into this space, like my point of entry into the space is as, a storyteller. And I recognize, the second part of that is like, I recognize that I hold certain privileges in playing that role. And this is how I do it, right? This is the way that I do it. And so I think that we're always, even with the first book I wrote, which is a book of story, it's all based on a lot of stories, right? I write about people who've experienced hate violence or profiling. And I don't come from all of those communities, nor have I experienced all
Right.
of those things, right?
Right.
But how do we tell those stories with humility? How do we tell them so that people who we're writing about feel like they're actually participating rather than being the subjects of a story?
Correct. Yeah.
What are the way, so these are some of the things I think about when I examine like my own privileges as well as my points of entry. But I
Yeah.
do feel like there is a role and space for everyone, and I think we
Hmm.
need everyone right now. And
Hmm.
if we play sort of purity politics against each other
Yes.
and do this kind of you're in but you're out,
Hmm.
um I don't actually think that's aligned with values of inclusion, nor is it going to help us win in some of
Yeah.
these fights that we're trying to fight.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. This like you have there's a like actually the beginning section, right? In your book, you say I'm holding it up for folks in the visual. The time is now, right? And
Mhm.
I told you I was going to do this, so I'm gonna read from a. I mean, there's so much. Like I feel like every line could be a story unfolded unto itself, and so
Mhm.
I've appreciated reading this book a couple of times, like be engaging it different ways and different points in
Mm,
time. But I'm going to read from here, and this is begins the section of that you call the time on the clock of the world is right now, because it goes into your position that we need all of us, as many of us, in engaging in this work in any way that we can. And you talk about all of these overlapping the crises, right? All of these overlapping crises stem from similar root causes: anti-black racism, imperialism and colonialism, extractive capitalist models, and histories of oppressive treatments towards communities. And so when I think about that sentence, and when we were reflecting earlier, it was like, oh, that's heavy. It is heavy. Um, and I also feel like that's the reason, like that underscores everything that you just talked about. Like this is
mm,
the why. This is why we need to stay in. How would you encourage us to see the interconnections between these concepts? Right. I didn't understand the interconnections among
mhm.
these concepts earlier on in my career. How might somebody who's entering in, like, how would you encourage us to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, and that whole idea of the time on the clock is now is
Hmm.
reflecting something that Grace Lee Boggs, who's
Yes.
an Asian American scholar and activist in Detroit, would always ask when she would bring community together, what time is it
Yes.
on the clock of the world? She would ask. And
Hmm.
so the response that I give to that is like the time is now, right? Like the
Uh-huh.
time is it's ripe. Um so in terms of recognizing those root causes, I think we all recognize that the inequities in our country and in our world are created by certain root causes, right? And I've named
Hmm.
some of them there. There are
Hmm.
many others, but
Hmm.
everything from misogyny to racism to indigenous invisibility. There are so many different root causes, but your question is so on point. How are they connected? And I think that's a process of learning.
Hmm.
In many ways, I honestly think that that's why I'm excited to be like living and working in this moment doing social change work,
Yes.
because I
Hmm.
do think that those interconnections are more visible than ever. I mean, even if
Hmm.
we look at, for example, the pandemic, we can see,
Hmm.
you can see how Black and Latinx communities experienced higher levels of illness and death. And why is that? We can trace that to root causes
Yes.
of
Absolutely.
underinvestment in those communities, right?
Hmm.
We can sort of look at how public institutions around health have been failing. And we can,
Hmm.
again, like look at how an extractive model of health is at the
Yes.
root of some of that, right? So I think that when we look at some of these issues, we can see these different root causes interplaying and being interconnected. And the way that we respond to that is ourselves being
Hmm.
organized in an interconnected manner rather than looking at
Yeah.
everything in silos. And I wish sometimes, I mean, I hope even as we are
Hmm.
thinking about this response to the pandemic, I often wonder, is the healthcare sector in conversation with,
Yes.
right, other sectors, or
Uh-huh.
and vice versa? Because if we don't do more of that, if we don't
Hmm.
build more connected and diverse ecosystems to deal with these issues, we're, I think, just constantly going to be in the cycle of putting band-aids on things and not really getting to the root causes. And so part of, I think, the challenge for the time is now is not to just respond in a band-aid way, but to actually identify the root causes and then figure out how we respond to them, not just as one person or one organization or one sector, but as an interconnected ecosystem that cares about, eliminating those root causes and cares about all of the communities that live in a particular area. I think that's the hard work that's ahead of us.
I'm chuckling a little bit because this is a very serious and important conversation, and I love the wisdom that you bring to the space. This is, my parents wanted me to be a medical doctor, so this is the one time I'm going to offer like a faux scientific reflection on what you said.
Go for it, Mamta.
And I think about, the human body, right? And I think about, we talk about circulatory, right? Like that's what we learned in school. Circulatory, we have all the different systems in the body. And yet, without the connective tissue, none of this stuff works. And I think, as I'm now understanding even more in our conversation, your model, I feel, is a calling for all of us to rebuild and nurture the connective tissue so that the rest of the systems actually are able to be as effective as they can be.
Yeah.
Now, if there's a medical
amazing
doctor there.
metaphor.
I don't know
that's
if
an
it's
amazing
true or not,
metaphor, because it is true, because our body is
yeah.
an ecosystem too, right?
Mhm.
Just as like the,
Yeah.
the pond down the street is an ecosystem, the coral reef, they're all ecosystems. And a lot of people have been talking and writing, like Adrienne Marie Brown and others, about sort of what we learn from nature and how that understanding, how different species or even our bodies work, that we can learn so much about how the interconnection and the interplay should be when we're organizing ourselves into different institutions and networks. So there's a lot there, and I absolutely agree. That's why the word ecosystem is mentioned so much in my book.
Yeah, well, I think I love the intentional use of the term ecosystem. I mean, the resonance around we are interconnected and we are stronger. We can advocate for a greater level of change when we kind of hold on to one another. It really, it spoke to me. I feel like I wish I had this tool when I was younger. And I'm grateful to have it now, right? So there isn't a timeline on this that, as we kind of talked about, the time is now, right?
The time is now. Yeah. And I think, I really want to encourage and invite folks to look at this as an individual tool that can help us build our awareness, but to take it a step further, right? It's intended to increase our level of self-awareness to a particular end. And that end is that we take all that knowledge and we actually then think about how we're showing up in a broader ecosystem to bring about institutional change and policy change and structural change. And so it's really kind of an overarching goal. And I think when people and organizations are able to do that, I do feel like there are some aha revelations and even some changes in programming, fundraising, talking about the organization, right, that can happen.
Absolutely. And I hear you talking about organizations, right, and infrastructures. I want to, I don't think it's stepping back, but I want to reflect on probably my most salient identity. This is a surprise to zero people who know me. And that is that of a parent, of mom. And so my daughter is in high school, just started 9th grade. And my head is spinning. She's seen the book in the house and she loved the map. So, the book comes with the open up map and she's like, whoa, what is this? And I'm like, hold on. Like, I haven't processed yet, like how I want to engage this conversation with you. But like, as if you could offer reflection to me as a parent, like, how might I engage this with my 9th grader?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. In so many different ways. Yes. I love it. Yeah, I have a 7th grader. So I also, that the parent identity is super prominent in my life too. I would say a couple of different ways, and I've actually like used it with my own son. So it comes from personal experience, but I've also seen others use the
Yeah.
map in ways with their children or as parents with young folks. So one is it is a teaching tool. So,
Hmm.
one of the things that I have done with my son is sort of helped him understand the movement for voting rights that happened in the South, and particularly with the March to Selma.
Hmm.
And what we did was we combined the map and some work that was done through the Zen Education Project,
Yep.
where we learned about like different folks that were really part of that movement, right? And
Hmm.
then I would ask my son to sort of say, well, what role do you think they're playing here, right? Are they builders? Are they visionaries? And
Uh-huh.
we were able to, so he would map out their names on the framework. And then kids are like, they come up with their own revelations, right? Very
Right.
quickly. We don't
Absolutely.
even just have to like put it in place and they get there. And so he would say things like, well, it looks like everyone did one or two things to make the goal happen, right? So
Right.
recognizing that it isn't just like one charismatic leader, that it
Yes.
takes like a movement and it's over time. And this is
Hmm.
how they were in connection with each other, even if we're not reading that in the history books, right? That they actually
Hmm.
communicated and they organized. And so
Yeah.
so it's a teaching tool to talk about historical events or historical
Yeah.
figures in social justice. It can also be utilized, obviously, to think about oneself. And
Yeah.
so to, think about, well, and I think I've seen kindergarten teachers use this framework,
Wow.
so
That's great.
yeah, to talk about like in our school system, in our school ecosystem, how do
Hmm.
different people play roles? Like, teachers
Oh,
are builders, and these students are the ones who are taking care of each other, so they're
yeah.
caregivers, right? So there are
Hmm.
different ways to even think about how to build those characteristics within ourselves
Hmm.
that at a young age we might even be aligned with. And then as kids get older, to think about how they can play those roles in order to do their like community change work or volunteer work or campus associations and organizations
Hmm.
and so on and so forth. So I think personal development and growth, personal awareness, history,
Yes.
teaching, all of that.
I'm super, I could talk to you for days. We're coming to the close of our time together, at least for the context of this podcast. I do have a question for you that I'm going to have you think about, but I have a reflection that I want to
Mm.
share after what you just said. So my question for you is, how do you create joy in your life? And so kind of reflect on that as I offer a reflection on what you just said. My wish and my reflection based on what you just talked about as the teaching tool within our K through 12 ecosystems is, oh my gosh, can Sesame Street please pick up your model and use that as a framework
What a
to
great
work with
idea.
our young people.
Let's
Yes.
manifest that.
So on this podcast, I want to manifest that Sesame Street picks up this beautiful model to talk with young people and parents who are watching around ways that we can hold on to one another in our ecosystem. But joy, how do you create joy?
I really love that. I really do. Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about joy, because I was recently just sharing with some friends that for the next year I really want to lean into this prose poem by Mary Oliver,
Oh,
which is like, joy is not made to be a crumb, right? If you like
yes.
suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate, give into it. And I think I don't know about you, but oftentimes I feel like I've been conditioned to feel like I'm not worthy of joy. I'm not
Yes.
um to accept it or to cultivate it, that it's like something that
Mm-hmm.
feels like a guilty pleasure almost, right? And I think that I'm really pledging to myself to kind of shift that orientation, and to cultivate it and then to share it, right? So for me, joy happens in different ways. It can be, like reading a book with my son,
Mm-hmm.
or watching my child with his grandparents.
Yes.
There are lots of ways in which I think joy kind of comes up, but to me it's about actually recognizing it and
Yes.
naming it as this is joy, and then sitting with it, for a little bit of time rather than kind of push it away or apologize for it or feel like, well, got to get on to the next thing.
Mhm.
So that's what it's. I'm. I think that I'm lucky that there are pockets of joy, but I don't know that I actually sit with them enough. So that's really
Uh-huh.
kind of the challenge for myself in the coming year.
Oh, I'm glad that that's what the kind of the closing reflection that our listeners and viewers get to experience. So, Deepa, thank you so much for your time and wisdom today. It's really more than the gift that I thought that you would bring, and so I'm just really just ecstatic and feel so whole in this moment. So thank you for being part of the Student Affairs Now
Thank you.
community.
Yeah.
I also want to take this moment to thank our sponsors again, Leadership and Simplicity. We appreciate your support. More specifically, Leadership partners with colleges and universities to create transformational leadership experiences, both virtual and in person, for students and professionals with a focus on creating a more just, caring, and thriving world. Leadership offers engaging learning experiences on courageous dialogue, integrity, equity, resilience, and community building. To find out more, please visit leadership.org/virtual programs or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And then Simplicity is the global leader in student services technological platforms with the state-of-the-art technology that empowers institutions to make data-driven decisions specific to their goals. A true partner to institutions, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life, including but not limited to career services and development, student conduct and well-being, student success and accessibility services. To learn more, visit simplicity.com or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And as always, much love and a huge shout out to Natalie Ambrosi, the producer for the podcast, who does all of the behind the scenes work to make us look and sound good. So, friends, if you are listening today and not already receiving our weekly newsletter, please visit our website at studentaffairsnow.com and scroll to the bottom of the homepage to add your email to our MailChimp list. While you're there, check out our archives. Once again, I'm Mamta Akapati. So much love and gratitude to everyone who is watching and listening. Please make it a beautiful week that honors your soul and spirit. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful, beautiful day.